Our next question is from Lord Evans of Rayno.
Give him his real name.
So he's Graham Evans, and he's got a very good question. This is it.
Back in the day, when I was a newly elected loyal MP, I was asked to join a couple of secret groups to help support the Prime Minister at Prime Minister's Questions and the Chancellor of the Exchequer at Treasury Questions by asking helpful questions and heckling their opposite number. We had several years of fun heckling and sledging Ed Miliband and latterly Jeremy Corbyn. The Treasury support group was run by the excellent Greg Hands, and we had fun heckling and sledging Alan Johnson and then Ed Balls. To my lasting shame, we focused on Ed's childhood history of stammering to put him off as best we could as he got up to speak from the dispatch box, to which I apologised to Ed. Question: what place, if any, does heckling still have in today's parliamentary questions, debates and public meetings?
I think there are sort of two questions here that Graham is kind of asking. The first is the big one, which is, does heckling still have a part to play in today's parliamentary questions and debates? And the truth is, noise matters in the House of Commons. It is a bear pit. We went through a kind of long period, didn't we, with sort of Jeremy Corbyn and so on, where it felt like a lot of the oxygen had been taken out of the House of Commons. But it feels like it's back. And I can just say, as the 33-year-old Shadow Chancellor who stood up against Gordon Brown and was greeted by a wall of brownite noise, it is unbelievably intimidating. If you're listening to this podcast, now imagine about 2 yards away from where you're listening to it, there are 300 people shouting at you. I mean, just imagine how loud that is. That is the reality of the experience. But I think Graham's got another question here, which is actually very specific, of course, to you, Ed, which is, you have and had a stammer. And so sometimes when you were speaking in Parliament, you stammered a bit. And the kind of Tory team, which, ultimately I was responsible for, would make fun of that. And Graham is saying, he's ashamed and embarrassed about it. I'm going to say, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that I think once you said you had a stammer, which we didn't actually know about for quite a long time, once you went public, actually we backed off not because, by the way, we were being like, gentlemen and ladies and being very proper. It's because we actually thought this is going to backfire on us. And so I think, Graham, I'm going to slightly disagree with you, Graham. I think once we knew, Ed, that you had a stammer, it wasn't as aggressive an operation as it had previously been. But that might be a real kind of rose-tinted memory of things.
Well, it definitely changed, and it also did change eventually after I'd been public. But in some ways, the toughest time was when I didn't even know it was a stammer myself. I should say, by the way, that I think heckling is really important in the House of Commons, and the cut and thrust is important. And I always loved it when I was doing debates and you had really good interventions, or somebody would say from a sedentary position something which everybody would laugh at. And the skill of being a front bencher is whether you can respond quickly and diffuse it or move on. So that's sort of the atmosphere of the debate. You
were chief sledger at David Cameron when he was doing Prime Minister's Questions.
Mainly by talking to you.
He used to drive Cameron mad.
I'm not sure if I necessarily thought it was the most edifying thing I ever did, but it was part of the parliamentary thing. But what is the case, when I was a junior Treasury Minister, I found Treasury Questions really hard. And by the way, Greg Hands was the main person who used to do the sledging, but he used to kind of he would mimic my stutter. He would do, and I didn't know what it was. And Gordon Brown would turn to me and say, "Keep going, keep going." And then, but actually, it was a Labour person who first called it out in a terribly difficult way for me when I was Secretary of State for Education. Gwyneth Dunwoody, the former Labour MP, said really loudly when I sat down in my first ever Cabinet Minister education questions, where I stammered on the very first answer. She said, "He's supposed to be the Secretary of State and he can't even get his words out." She said it echoed across the chamber. And I went back that day and said, I've got to do something, but what is this thing? And they came back to me and said, it's a stammer. I said, it's not, it can't be. And it was, but it took me ages to learn that it was this interiorized stammer. And I had 2 years of therapy, and they kept saying to me that I had to go public. And I said, I can't go public because cabinet ministers don't talk about this kind of thing, but they will never get better. I actually spoke publicly about it in, I think, 2009, but I don't think it ever really broke through in Westminster until after the autumn statement, where I was given a really hard time, which was very stammering targeted. And until this question from Graham, I I always suspected that it was done deliberately. I never knew it was kind of organised in this way. But, it was, that's politics and it's a rough old game. But that autumn statement was the one where I went on the Today programme the next morning and was given a very hard time by the presenter. And I said, I have a stammer and sometimes it happens and that's just life and you've got to own it. And I think maybe lots of people in Parliament didn't really clock it. I'd said it on GMTV, but until I said that on the Today programme, I hadn't kind of got through. I thought everybody knew because I'd said it, and of course they didn't. It's part of the story of stammering. People don't understand what it is. They don't see what it is. And part of what I tried to do was talk about it to make people understand it more. In the end, the going public made the difference. I never tried to stop people having a go at me in the House of Commons, but it was pretty tough.
Okay, let's take a break.
This episode of Political Currency is sponsored by British Airways.
Now, last week we shared some of our own journeys that have shaped us, and we asked you to send some of yours too.
Our journeys shape us through the places we go, the people we meet, and we were really keen to hear about some of your experiences. Let's hear the stories.
About 4 years ago, I took my longest ever break, about 3 weeks in Japan. It was like stepping into a completely different world. Often, when you're in Japan, you'll bump into loads of Japanese school tours, and they're seeing all the same big sights as I was, obviously, as a tourist. They were fascinated by my Western handwriting, and more than once, I'd have a group of school kids queuing up to get me to write into their journal because they wanted to see what me writing my name in English looked like and writing what the country I lived in looked like. I don't think my handwriting has ever been marvelled at, so it was a very small but memorable moment that really stuck with me. And I think the curiosity and appreciation of different cultures is probably one of the reasons Japan still feels so special to me.
A journey that had a really big impact on me was a trip to Namibia in 2022. There were about 15 of us on this trip and we went fully off-grid for 2 weeks, road tripping through the desert and the bush and then camping amongst all of the amazing nature and wildlife each night. And one thing that was really transformative was that we had no phone service or Wi-Fi for the 2 weeks we were away, which really allowed us to be present and reconnect with life's simple pleasures. Things like connection, stillness, nature were really important for us in this time, and honestly, it was absolute bliss.
So I didn't know much about Finland before I went on a trip there for work earlier this year, other than the fact that they apparently like saunas a lot. But this trip really did change my perspective on a lot of things, really. We went there with the purpose of finding out what makes the Finns so happy. They've been ranked the happiest people in the world for the 7th year running. And after asking lots of people this question and doing some interviews, a lot of people said the same thing, which is that they're very content with what they've got and they very much appreciate the proximity to nature. They spend a lot of their free time foraging for berries. That's a bit of a national pastime, as well as visiting the lakes and beautiful scenery around the cities. They're quite close to the countryside wherever they are. It just made me think that's quite a simple formula, really. They didn't have a kind of silver bullet to happiness, and it definitely didn't come from any sort of materialistic item. But it was a really amazing chance to spend a bit of time in a different culture and hear about what makes them happy and what happiness means to them.
It makes you want to go to Finland, doesn't it?
Well, I've been to Finland and it's a great country, but I tell you, I've always wanted to go to Namibia. So I've got a note to self to go and book my British Airways trip to Namibia after listening to Lucy's story.
I've never been to Namibia, but I did go to Finland for the European Council and still got the tie. Remember it very well. Still wear it, actually. Great trip.
No, I've got some gloves because it was so cold when I turned up in Finland. I was really ill-equipped and I went down to the market there and bought some gloves. And I've still got them. This was 20 years ago and they're brilliant.
And of course, our listeners will remember the Finnish jazz. Thank you to everyone who shared their stories with us. It might be time to start thinking about my next trip. I can't wait.
Don't forget the British Airways will take care of you for a lifetime of journeys. Visit britishairways.com to take a look at where we could go next. Right, welcome back.
To our final question, actually, which is from Sascha O'Sullivan, who is the host of Politico's Westminster Insider podcast. Go on then, Sascha, tell us your question.
Hi, Ed and George. It's Sascha here from Politico's podcast, Westminster Insider. George, it was great to have you on the pod, even if I did only have to slightly strong-arm you into doing an interview at the Political Podcast Awards. I wanted to ask you both what you think about the decision to raise defence spending and how it's been briefed as coming from number 10 over Rachel Reeves' head. How do you think the relationship between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor influences the relative power of the Treasury? And have efforts to reduce its power, a la Boris Johnson versus Sajid Javid, ever been successful?
Well, I have no idea whether Keir Starmer made this decision over the head of Rachel Reeves. I'd be very surprised. But anybody who thinks it strengthens Keir Starmer by briefing that he's overruled the Chancellor is a fool. And it never works. And in the end, it was to Boris Johnson's detriment, the way they tried to treat Sajid Javid. And he and Rishi Sunak took eventual revenge. And, that partnership, it needs challenge, but it's a partnership.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And by the way, Sascha, thanks for having me on your pod. I mean, the first thing is, I've said this before, I think, on the show, but I'll say it again, and I'll say it to anyone who is either Prime Minister or Chancellor. Go outside into the street of Downing Street and look at the front door of number 10, and it says First Lord of the Treasury on the door. So a Prime Minister cannot contract out to their Chancellor all the decisions about the economy and public spending. And there's a long history of Prime Ministers overruling Chancellors on defence spending or certainly, making the decision and informing the Chancellor. And in fact...
Did David Cameron ever make a decision on defence spending and inform you?
No, we had a
I
very...
don't think Tony Blair ever made a decision on defence spending and inform Gordon Brown. They definitely had views. And in the end, as Chancellor, you had to find an accommodation, but inform you or brief that they'd overruled you?
No. But that spoke to partly the relationship between me and David, which, as I was explaining to Sascha, I don't think... I mean, lots of Chancellors since, and there have been quite a lot of Chancellors since me, I think 6 or 7, have briefed out, my relationship with the Prime Minister is like George and David. I mean, that's literally what Sajid Javid said of Boris Johnson before Boris Johnson basically forced him out. And I've heard it talked about in the context of Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. The truth is, we are and were then very good friends. And I think that was quite unique. And we've discussed on this podcast whether there were also downsides to it, which I actually discussed with Sascha, points you made to me, Ed, about maybe there wasn't enough sort of challenge, therefore, in the relationship. But, so the relationships are always going to be different between Prime Ministers and Chancellors, but they are different jobs. The Prime Minister is the ultimate person responsible for the government. And to the sort of direct question, can you clip the wings of the Treasury? A strong Prime Minister would not want to clip the wings of the Treasury because a strong Prime Minister would use the Treasury to achieve what they want to achieve. But the fundamental point is the Prime Minister is the First Lord of the Treasury and he wants or she wants a strong Chancellor at their side.
I think that's right. But it's partly about the personal relationship. It's partly about the strength of each individual within the party. But a lot of that also flows from the size of the majority. And of course, David Cameron and you were Prime Minister and Chancellor without a majority, where your partnership was vital to the success and the sustainability of the government. Good Prime Ministers, you're right, appoint strong Chancellors. But Chancellors also have a constitutional duty in those moments, not just to do what the Prime Minister says, come what may, because they are the First Lord of the Treasury. And in the end, the one thing the Prime Minister can do is sack you. But short of sacking you, you should always, as Chancellor, especially with a large majority, make sure that your partnership reaches an agreement, which is a good agreement, not a bad agreement. And this idea that Keir Starmer might say, I've got a majority of 170, I'm the Prime Minister, so I am just announcing this and you will do as you're told. That is not the right way for things to be done.